I do not know if there were precursors to the idea of unavoidable horror, one from which you cannot escape and which is specifically targeting you. Perhaps there must have been some sort of horrors like this in the form of curses. The Mummy certainly seems to play with this idea, and the excellent Lovecraftian video game Amnesia: The Dark Descent portrayed a curse very well. No matter how far on Earth you ran, it came for you. And I'm sure it is something common enough in Gothic horror, though that isn't really my domain to comment on. I say precursors because when I think of unavoidable horror, I think of H.P. Lovecraft and his tales where the protagonists literally are unable to escape their horrific destiny, no matter what they do. This theme pops up quite regularly in Lovecraft's stories, and I think it will be helpful to discuss it here. How can you save yourself, have a vaguely happy ending even, when the source of horror is literally that which is running through your veins? No cure can save you. It is what you are. Your DNA carries it. To destroy your own DNA would be to destroy yourself. A modern day equivalent we see a lot in media, though much less potent, as you'll agree on later in this video I'm sure, will be when an infection dooms you. A bite from a vampire, zombie, or werewolf is the most common transmission of such a fate, though in some cases, depending on the creative direction of the story, there is a cure. In any case, the horror of the fate awaiting you after the bite is then in your blood, albeit via an infection. It spreads and takes you over, changing your features by adding abilities or physical characteristics. You change. What made Lovecraft include this concept in his horror? I might say that given that the man is a horror specialist and a master of the genre, he simply realized how horrific the notion is. But it is a fact that he wrote with an autobiographical streak in his stories, inserting his personal fears and ideas into his tales. If we look at his personal life, we can see a few points which added some inspiration to his pen. Disease. Disease, especially the inherited kind, was a concern for Lovecraft. His father suffered horribly from syphilis, which landed him in what was basically an asylum. Syphilis in its late stages brutally affects the brain's ability to function and can drive you, for lack of a better word, insane. His mother also had a spell in such an institution, though not from syphilis. She had her own, shall we say, unique temperament which perhaps wasn't the healthiest and rubbed off badly on Lovecraft. Of course, nowadays there are treatments for syphilis, and unless you're having too much unprotected fun in Vietnam, you're probably not going to get it. Just make sure you only fuck the ones that cough, though. Lovecraft was of course not in risk of inheriting the disease that his father ended up having. However, with the imaginative mind that he had, it was not difficult in seeing the horror of inheriting a disease and having it be a part of your very being, and then amplifying that concept for the sake of a weird tale. There are some diseases which can be inherited from birth. Schizophrenia is one which is basically the definition of mental derangement once you strip away all the medical jargon. Although it can be treated somewhat with medication, remember that Lovecraft was born in 1890, and the ease of treating medical issues that we have today didn't all exist back then. Syphilis, for example, was first successfully cured only in 1943. That was even after Lovecraft had died. You can also be born with other diseases which can doom you to death from birth. Growing up in South Africa, this was a constant terror for me, catching this disease.
AIDS?
And I recall my school trying to send us to this AIDS orphanage to go play with the little kids. I tell you, I got into a lot of trouble for telling my school to go shove it, and I refused to go.
Stick it up your ass.
Of course, you can treat HIV now with medication, and again, supposedly, you can have a long, healthy life, but it's still there, lingering in your blood. The idea of a virus infecting you, taking over your body, your cells, your core, it's horrific. The concept of disease is best seen in the masterpiece of cosmic horror, which is John Carpenter's The Thing. An alien entity crash lands on Earth, wakes up, probably not in the best of moods, and then infects anything it touches. It invades the cells of its host's body, eventually taking them over, and the host is replaced. What results from your infection is an almost perfect mimic. Seriously though, if you've not watched this film, as penance for the sin against cosmic horror, I order you to pause this video and go watch it. And you have to subscribe to this channel for re-education purposes. Of course, the disease that worried Lovecraft was not so much one from infection, but from inheritance. This is a glaring difference, to be fair, and more prominent in his stories than that of viruses. Which, offhand, I can only really think of one story which dealt with that type of thing, The Color Out of Space, and that was more likened to radiation than a virus. A virus or disease in the world of horror involves a change, implying there was once a state of being where the individual was clean, uninfected, a normal human. A human before being bitten by the foul werewolf was just a man or a woman. One may lament one's demise, but one can find a small peace of mind that this change is not representative of who they are as a person. They suffer under it and wish for a return to their old selves. But you think that this concept was horrific enough for our guy, the Gentleman of Providence? Nah, that's amateur hour. He stepped things up. If you're born into the condition, it is much heavier a burden to bear. This is what Lovecraft feared. If you're born into some horrific state, and I'll give some examples from his literature just now, the fate is you. You are destined to it. You cannot hope or lament for a cure, or to return to your untainted state, because it never existed. An example we can look at is The Outsider, his most autobiographical tale in my opinion. We see his protagonist lament his fate of living in a miserable, dark, damp castle surrounded by horrific black woods. Finally, he forsakes that place to find other humans, but then sees a mirror. He sees what he really is, what he always was. After the initial anguish, he then accepts his fate and embraces what he is, but not in that retarded way you see in an Oprah-endorsed housewife novel like Eat, Pray, Love. More like, if I'm gonna be a ghoul, yeah, it's horrific, but I might as well go with it, and I'll lose my mind too. The protagonist from The Outsider didn't suffer from a disease, it is assumed, but the metaphor is crystal clear that he was always like that. A further tale comes from The Rats in the Walls. We see our protagonist, Delapour, buy an ancestral homestead and rebuild it only to discover that there are massive grottos beneath it. Upon investigating further, he finds out that his bloodline had degenerated into horrific, mad things. The discovery of what his family, his bloodline, had been doing over the centuries drove him mad. He states to one of the characters as he proceeds to murder and half devour him, "Curse you, Thornton, I'll teach you to faint at what my family do." This line undoubtedly showcases the horror of inherited illnesses and madness, that what you were born as is sufficient to doom you eventually. However, in the story, if I recall correctly, it was not via race mixing that this Delapour curse came to be. This leads to another fear of Lovecraft. Race mixing. This is an issue with which Lovecraft had a small problem. Ironically, he did end up marrying a Jew from the then Russian Empire. He passed this off by stating that she was sufficiently anglicized and integrated into the Teutonic Anglo-Saxon culture. Nonetheless, he did not approve of race mixing in general, let alone in the bedroom. Sonia Green, his wife, mentioned in her letters that when the couple was walking in the vibrant, diverse, and culturally enriched parts of New York City, Lovecraft dropped more red pills than a seasoned 4chan poll user after a few drinks. His letters of his time in New York City are especially heated, as he describes how the city became a hub of immigration, which affected the charm he only managed to see in his first moments of life in that city. We can see his concerns for New York City raised in the stories He and the Horror at Red Hook, which are also some of the best examples of his mindset and depression in this time of his life. However, we're talking about the horrors in one's blood, are we not? In both the Innsmouth and the Arthur Jermyn tales, the monstrous entities, those being the Deep One hybrids and the ape-like Jermyn bloodline respectively, originated via humans having relations, shall we say, with non-human entities. These stories all tell of protagonists who appear to be ordinary human beings, but due to their birth they are doomed to a certain fate, typically something abhorrent to the tastes of a normal human being. That horror cannot be avoided. The change for the worse is inevitable. It was lesser so in the Arthur Jermyn tale, where it was merely revulsion at the family origins that led Arthur Jermyn, whose genetics were linked to that travesty of interspecies erotica performed by his ancestor in the darkest parts of Africa, to pour oil over himself and light himself up. The Shadow over Innsmouth truly shows this horror at the mixing of bloods. If a person has ancestry going back to a Deep One, even if it was many generations ago, it is very likely that that change will come to that person. They will eventually turn into a Deep One, though there are cases where the change isn't enough, yet enough to make you stand out from other humans for certain. Although on the surface many critics of Lovecraft see this as merely his terrors of race mixing in the bedroom, The Shadow over Innsmouth seems to me too complex and well thought out to simply be that. The tale does clearly mention racial mixing, that of humans and deep ones, but in the big picture we learn from Zadok Allen's monologue how Innsmouth used to be. A thriving seaport, clean, rich, in order, and safe. Then after the shadow fell over that fine city, after the influence of the deep ones gripped that town, it turned into the Innsmouth that we all know now of. If Lovecraft could only have seen how things are in France and England now, let alone the United States. Yes, I think that the Innsmouth tale, besides being on the surface just a bloody good weird tale and cornerstone of Lovecraftian horror, also took into consideration the horror of cultural destruction as an incompatible foreign element encroaches on the host. Returning to the mixing of blood, in the case that you are of the Germain line, or one of the Marsh's Waits, or so on, from the Innsmouth tale, the families which interbred with the deep ones, your fate is sealed. Either you embrace your fate and thus lose your humanity and make peace with the fact that you'll never be fully human, ever, not that you were to begin with, or take the only other option available. The choice is of course yours. Each man and woman must choose their own destiny. The protagonist from the Shadow of Innsmouth chose to live and change. Arthur Germain chose not to. So in such a case, the choice is always up to you, but there are only ever two choices. I know some of you are thinking, geez, Lovecraft was just a little bit overboard and neurotic about this type of thing, but this is the mentality that he had. The fact is that Lovecraft was of very good breeding and came from what was essentially the upper class. Yes, his family were middle class technically, but I'm sure he'd agree that was just an error of the gods. In reality, he was more like a noble person and yearned for the monarchy to be upheld, or to be in a time where there were monarchs. He saw civilization as a great thing, the pinnacle of humanity, built up by the great peoples of Europe as he saw it, the Greeks, Romans, Anglo-Saxons and Teutons. He did not want to see any degradation of that or what they had produced. Thus, I hope that in my video here, I've been able to show you how horrific it would have been for Lovecraft to see horror in what was supposed to be the element which was responsible for the greatness of humanity, blood. Thank you for taking time to watch my video. If you liked it, I'd appreciate it if you click on the like button and help my channel fight against the brutal YouTube algorithms. I also have other channels on other websites where I mirror my content just in case YouTube goes overboard with their censorious tendencies. If you're looking to pick up some new material to read, then head over to thebizarchives.com, where you can pick up quality bizarre, pulp, cosmic fiction, either in hard copies or on digital devices. Of particular interest right now to fans of cosmic horror will be The Molybdus Articulate by Shane Hawkes, a figure to watch for future releases of the genre. Anyway, that's all I've got for this video. I hope you have a great night, and I'll see you in the comment section below. Cheers.